Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Daniel Polisar. Dr. Polisar is the Executive Vice President and co-founder of the Shalem College in Israel. He has his PhD in government from Harvard University, where he was a recipient of both the Truman and Fulbright scholarships. He is an author, he is a scholar, and he is a person who I've had the pleasure of having conversations with in the past and have learned so much from him. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Polisar.
Thank you. It's really a privilege.
So I want to get started with your hat as a former president of a college and what's going on in the United States today on college campuses and your thoughts about the kind of demonstrations, the challenges where people claiming free speech versus the right to make others feel persecuted and uncomfortable. What are your thoughts about what's going on in the States today?
So, to me, it's very disturbing, both as a graduate of American liberal arts universities and as somebody who's been active in building a liberal arts college in Israel. And it's been disturbing in two ways. The first of them are the things that students are choosing to say in these demonstrations. Free speech is very important, and I'm not commenting on whether people have a right to say this or that about Hamas, but rather that a significant number of students believe that the way for them to express themselves morally is by supporting the activities of Hamas on October 7th, which is to say gang rape, torture, kidnapping, and murdering. Let's grant for the moment that they have a perfect constitutional university given right, but that they would choose to use that right to defend behavior which in the eyes of civilized people ought to be indefensible is deeply disturbing about the state of students at not the weakest of the American colleges and universities, but at those schools that are considered the most elite, the most prestigious, the most competitive, that are educating the people who have the greatest chance to become future leaders. So it's disturbing for what it says about a significant portion of young intellectual Americans. But I guess as somebody who's been involved in building a college, I'm even more disturbed by the reactions of so many of the university administrators. We've seen at Brown and at Northwestern, among other places, rewarding students for violating the university's rules, for harassing other students, for preferring the political over the intellectual and the immoral over taking a stand for decent values. And the fact that leading universities would make deals with students that they will be allowed to present their proposals for divesting from Israel in exchange for their agreeing to stop breaking the rules and having encampments, to me, that's really horrifying behavior. There are times when, as an administrator, your job is to be very unpopular and to say, we have rules. Those rules are designed to enable us to have a functioning intellectual community, a place where people respect one another. You break those rules, you will be punished, even expelled, but certainly not rewarded. That, for me, has been the most difficult part of this to watch.
Well, how did the universities get to that place? How did we get to this place?
It's been a process that has taken literally decades to get to, but the last several years have been witnessing an acceleration of it. Part of it is the kind of blind acceptance of this idea that the world can be divided into the oppressed and the oppressors, and that this simple and simple-minded way of viewing things gives you enough of a lens to pronounce moral judgment. And that is accepted in large swaths of the universities, not just the students, but perhaps especially the faculty. So that idea has become strongly ensconced. The second thing is there is a reward for bad behavior in general. This whole cancel culture, if you allow so-and-so to speak at the graduation, then we'll shout them down, we'll turn around, we'll block people. The idea that you can block free speech in these kinds of ways has opened the floodgates for all kinds of behavior, which is not appropriate for a place that ought to allow free, civilized, and respectful discourse. And we are now reaping what we have sown in academia, and we're seeing an even uglier side of the cancel culture and of the simplistic division of the world into good and evil based on who has power and who doesn't.
Do you think it's possible to close this Pandora's box and begin to move back to what had been the social mores?
I think it's definitely possible. History often works via pendulum, and what swings one way can swing back in the other direction. That's true in general, but I think in the particular case, there's an excess that has been happening at the universities that is not widely supported outside of the universities. Because I think there would be great support on the part of most Americans, on the part of most donors of these institutions, on the part of most parents, and actually on the part of most of the students for strong leadership. I think when the University of Chicago, for example, took a much stronger stance against these kinds of anti-intellectual, disrespectful activities. And I think there's a real tailwind behind that. And what is needed now is real leadership at these universities. And if the leaders would lead, other people would say, you know what? They're right. We let things go too far in a certain direction. And it's good that we're moving back now towards the traditional values of civility and decency and mutual respect. So I think there's tremendous opportunity for leadership. It's being seized in a small number of cases, and the opportunity is being missed in other cases. But I'm quite hopeful that what's happening now is actually going to prove to be beneficial because it's a wake-up call. It's so extreme and so inappropriate that people are going to say, whoa, if we went this far, now's our chance to turn things around before it gets even worse. So I'm actually hopeful that what is destructive today will be beneficial in terms of building tomorrow.
I don't know if you saw in today's New York Times, Bret Stephens has a column where it's a thank you column to the protesters for having gone too far, where it's made things clear that this is something totally unaccepted, that if they had taken a middle, more reasoned ground, it would be more difficult for Zionists to defend themselves, which sounds a little bit on the same path of what you're taking in this
It's
conversation.
it's vintage Bret Stephens. He's a superb thinker and a fantastic writer. And this piece is the latest in a long series that he's written that have really opened up new and very important ground.
I want to shift over to Israel now, with your permission, and to talk a little bit about what's going on, and also to understand a little bit of what you're going through as the parent of three sons who were in active duty and now are slated to go back in. But first, in terms of the Rafah operation, what's happening today in Rafah, and also the bizarre situation with Hamas yesterday, all of a sudden saying they're going for a ceasefire as soon as the army had started doing some limited operation already in Rafah. Where do you think this is headed?
Look, I think it's headed in the direction that it has to go in from Israel's point of view and from the point of view of the West. What happened on October 7th was not only atrocities on a moral level, but on a political level. And it's something that's absolutely anathema to Israel as a sovereign nation. You cannot allow any group, whether it's a terrorist group or a government or a rogue army, to cross your border, murder, torture, gang rape, and then boast about the tale. And live to boast about it for another day, and then talk about how they want to do it again. From the point of view of Israel, and this would be the case for any country that was acted upon in this way, there's only one acceptable outcome to this war, which is that the Hamas leadership and fighters, terrorists who perpetrated these atrocities and threatened to do so again, have to end the war having been defeated soundly. That means the vast majority of the fighters need to be killed or captured. The leadership of Hamas needs to be killed or captured. If that happens, then it will be understood first and foremost in Gaza, but perhaps even more importantly by Hezbollah in Lebanon and by the Iranian leadership, that when you cross a certain line against Israel, you are essentially sealing your fate. And that line has been crossed, and Israel has to destroy Hamas. There is no other reasonable or acceptable outcome. And I'm speaking here, obviously, in my own name as an Israeli, but I think if you were to speak to the vast majority of Israelis, they would say the same thing. And I think if you were to speak to the vast majority of Americans who really know what's going on the ground, they would say that's how the war has to be ended.
But if we,
Rafah,
I'm sorry, but if we watch
Rafah is the, sorry.
if we watch the news in the United States, they also highlight the protests that are happening in Israel now because of that tension between getting the hostages back sooner, which may force a ceasefire that would be too soon, and versus continuing the war. Is that, do you feel that in Israel, or is it more the way the media, the Western media is picking it up?
It's certainly significant, but I think it has to be put within the context of Israel's war aims. The aim of Israel is to destroy Hamas. The operation in Rafah, is absolutely essential for that. Right now, if Israel allows the Rafah stronghold to remain with several thousand Hamas fighters, perhaps as many as 10,000 still surviving, the day Israel pulls out, that Hamas force takes over Gaza again, regardless of any group that's gone in there in the interim to try to administer Gaza, which is to say, Hamas will correctly be seen as having won. If, on the other hand, Israel goes into Rafah in force, not just a tactical operation, but an operation designed to do in Rafah what Israel already did in Gaza City and Khan Yunis, Jabalia, and other places, then Hamas will be largely rooted out. And I don't know what's going to replace Hamas. I don't think anybody does, but everybody will understand that if you do these things to Israel, you'll pay the price, and that will help reestablish Israeli deterrence. And I think Israelis, broadly speaking, understand that that's the case. Having said that, Israelis love one another, sometimes too much, care about one another, sometimes too much. And so if you ask the question, what should be our top priority, as was done in a recent poll by the Israel Democracy Institute, you might get a majority saying that the top priority is to bring out the hostages because people can't bear the idea of leaving in that hellhole several dozen living hostages. And that's what they'll tell you, and that's what they'll feel. But if you look at what they really want the government to do and the way they react when the government acts in certain ways, their top priority is to destroy Hamas. And I was yesterday, I spent time in the area around Gaza visiting each of my three sons who are in bases on the border there. At least two of them are likely to be going in as part of the operation. And you talk to the soldiers, they have utter moral clarity. Yes, they want to help save the hostages, but they believe that the only way that they can do it is to go in and continue destroying Hamas. And I think they have the backing of the overwhelming majority of Israelis in seeing that as the way to achieve the goal. And the fact that Hamas wouldn't even admit in its own way that they were willing to accept the hostage deal until we had begun the attack is indicative of the fact that they will only respond if you're holding a club over them and they think they have something to lose and not just a way to terrorize you.
So if we can go a little further into the personal side, you have three sons in the border along Gaza, and you're a parent who knows some of them are going in, or all of them will be going in. But you're not alone. This is every family in Israel has that close relative. How does it impact you? How does it impact the citizens of Israel who have their children fighting this war?
We moved to Israel 30 some years ago, my wife and I, understanding that our children would be serving in the army. We are not the parents who had this illusion that our children would be the first generation not to have to serve in the army. We knew that this struggle to establish and maintain a Jewish state was going to be determined over the course of many generations. So we raised our children with a strong belief in serving their country and the understanding that they would have to take risks. We're incredibly proud that all three of our sons are not only serving, but serving happily, going above and beyond. The personal impact on me is number one, I'm completely obsessed with the war. I follow every development about it. I've been very, very involved in helping to provide essential gear to the soldiers, starting with my sons and the 300 or so people who serve in their units, and then going on to many, many thousands of other soldiers. Because if my sons and their comrades in arms have what they need, how can I go to sleep at night if others don't do the same? So I'm very focused on it. I'm proud of my own sons, and for reasons I cannot explain, I'm not very worried. I know what the statistics are. I know that in the platoon of one of my sons, out of the 30 soldiers, one of them was just critically injured. That could just as easily have been that son. There have been people in his company of 100 some odd soldiers who have been killed. In fact, in each of my son's units, people have been killed. So if I looked at the statistics, I'd be scared. I don't think we have any divine guarantee that my sons are going to come through the war unscathed, but I don't really think about the danger, and they don't think about the danger. They're eager to get in and finish the job, and I'm eager to help them. And I think a lot of parents are like that. We're just very focused on how can we make sure that Israel comes out of the war stronger than we went into it.
Do you have the feeling that the family's reactions are unique in this war versus other wars that Israel has survived and won?
You mean the reactions of families of
Reactions of that sense of pride and that sense of confidence and all of that. It's amazing when we're watching it from this side of the ocean, and even what you mentioned, that you're making sure they have what they need. Now, since the War of Independence, I can't imagine an Israeli army not having everything it needs, but now we know it didn't have everything that at least the soldiers wanted. The Israeli army may have said, we have what we need, but we've been providing more. And that sense uh, of of understanding the importance and following it and being proud, and not that worry, that sense of confidence and also moral clarity. Is this something unique in this war? I know you weren't there for the other wars, but from hearing from
It's something unique to Israel. It's not unique to this war. My wife and I have been in Israel for 30 plus years, and whether it was in Operation Defensive Shield, striking down the terror forces in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and Gaza from 2002 to 2004, or the Second Lebanon War in 2006, or the various wars against Hamas in Gaza from 2008 and on, Israelis have a sense of moral clarity. We understand what it means to be trying to build your state, while others just want to tear it down and care more about destroying you than they do about building up their own societies. And in every war, you see a massive surge of unity. You see that the number of soldiers who show up for combat duty when called up to the reserves is more than 100% of those who are called up, meaning if they called for 100 soldiers in a particular unit, 98 of them will show up. Two of them have back problems or are traveling abroad or whatever else. And in addition to those 98 out of 100, another 22 will report who weren't called on, and they'll use their protectia, their connections, in order to be accepted into the unit. So what makes this war different is instead of 120% of a call-up rate, it's 130% or 140%. And I think that's because the way this war started injected a sense of moral clarity and a sense of urgency into Israelis that led the society that I consider to be the greatest anywhere in the world to rise even more to the occasion. And we're part of various parents groups of parents of soldiers, and I spent a lot of time talking to parents and to other family members and to the soldiers. Incredible solidarity, incredible moral clarity. And just to bring that back to how we opened on the American college campuses, as strange as this might sound, I really feel sympathy for American Jews and pro-Israel students on college campuses. They're in a worse situation than I am, because it's true, my sons are risking their lives, and I am cognizant of the dangers that they face, but they're risking their lives surrounded by people who know exactly why they're doing what they're doing, total moral clarity within the army and within society. Whereas if you're a student at Columbia or Northwestern or Penn or Stanford or any of a host of other places, you're surrounded by people, including Jewish students, who either lack moral clarity or have a perverse form of moral clarity that leads them to pay homage to gang rapists. And must be terrible to be with people whose moral views are so different from one's own, and who are not able to distinguish between what is clearly a side that is fighting on behalf of the values that are at the core of civilization and people who are seeking to undermine them. Much easier to be Israeli than to be an American Jew right now.
And now, how does this bode for the future of Zionism and the future after the war? Do you see this creating a resurgence of Zionistic pride and building and spirit? Or
We're seeing that resurgence in Israel already, and we're seeing a resurgence of actual strong interest in all kinds of Jewish practices within the army. People are wearing tzitziot. There's like a crisis of demand. The people couldn't even keep up with the number of soldiers who wanted to be wearing these, fringed religious ritual garments, and they called them a shachpatza ruchani, the spiritual protective vest. And it's a sense that if Judaism is under attack, I want to be more embracing of my Judaism, combined with the healthy dose of there are no atheists in foxholes. But I think the way that it's going to play out is going to depend in large part on whether Israel's leadership has the fortitude to win the war. Right? We've lost more than 260 soldiers since the ground war began, in addition to many hundreds who were killed on October 7th. If Israelis feel that we paid this price and the price is going to grow in the coming weeks, but we succeeded in restoring deterrence and some sense of justice, and most importantly, allowed Israelis who had been displaced from the Gaza envelope communities to be followed by Israelis who were displaced on the northern border because of Hezbollah's terrorism, then people are going to feel like we made sacrifices, just as our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents did to build this state, but we were able to be worthy of being the next link in this chain. We did our role in enabling this country and this people to flourish. And if that happens, the surge of pride and solidarity and commitment is going to be great. If, however, Israel's leaders make the mistake of heeding the voices from Washington, telling them only limited operations, and your main goal is not to defeat the enemy, but to make sure that civilians aren't hurt, and you really need to stop, and you need to slow down, and this is dangerous, and so on. If those voices are heeded and Israel stops short of a victory, then Israelis are going to feel that the price that we've paid over these months wasn't worth it because we didn't succeed in the most minimal things. Uh, I'm reasonably confident that because Israeli society is united, our leadership, regardless of the views of the particular individuals, is going to do the right thing. And then we're going to see an Israeli state that, while in pain from what has happened and in mourning over what has happened, is even stronger than we went into the war. I'm quite optimistic as to how this can turn out if we keep doing the right things.
but the Israeli politics from the beginning of the war, people were talking about after the initial problems with the army's response, that there was this great confidence in Tzahal, in the army, and a lack of confidence in the government. And basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, if the government does the right thing where we don't have a lot of confidence in them, and Tzahal is allowed to do what they were doing, it will end up good. And you're feeling confident that the government will continue to do the right thing?
It's my thoughts are not about this or that politician, but rather my assumption is that on balance, political figures will do what their country's uh, grand strategy requires of them, what the situation demands of them, and what the public wants. And the Israeli public wants its leadership to be strong, to do what's right for Israel, even if that means temporary disagreements with our strongest ally and backer, the United States. And I happen to think it's also in the political interests of the current leadership to do that, because if the leadership allows itself effectively to lose the war, there's going to be tremendous anger, correctly focused on that leadership. So even if the country's leaders didn't care about the true aims of Israel, I think the politics driven by the strength of Israeli society would force them to do the right thing. I'm not saying they don't care about the country's fate. Let's give everybody the benefit of the doubt. They also care about it, but they're politicians and they want to stay in power. And the best way for any leader in Israel to stay in power right now is to prosecute the war firmly. We should, of course, care about minimizing Palestinian casualties. I'm not in any way suggesting we should be callous, but the overall goal of the army is to defeat an enemy that tried to destroy our country and our citizens. And as long as the government is doing that, I think they'll have as much support as they can have, given the various issues that are still controversial within Israel.
How important are the mea culpas? That there have been a few where people have taken responsibility for what happened. Is it really important to the Israeli public to say, I'm at blame, I'm at fault? To hear those kind of statements?
I think it is important because Israelis correctly understand that the failure of October 7th was a Yom Kippur War level of failure. This is not just like the Second Lebanon War, where it turned out that the storage areas that the army had for gear were largely empty and we were sending our soldiers out unprepared. That was a local, very important failure that certainly cost lives and led to unnecessary injuries and the like. But it wasn't a strategic failure. But the failure of Israel's intelligence and the failure to deploy properly and the failure to react properly shook the confidence of Israelis in their leaders, the military leaders, and those leaders need to demonstrate, I understand. I personally failed in what I was doing. I think Israelis want to see that. I think it would be a great lesson to all of us. We're all flawed human beings, and to see people who are at the height of power within a military that is widely respected in the country standing up and saying, I bear responsibility, I think that would be a great lesson. And if we see the opposite of it, then I think Israelis are going to be disappointed. There's still a high level of faith in the army because the army's fighting this war very, very well. One can criticize this element or that element. They should be doing this a little more quickly, and they should be taking greater care with Palestinian lives in certain cases. And there are criticisms one can level, but on balance, the Israeli army is fighting this war more effectively and with a greater regard to Palestinian civilian life, as well as a greater regard to the lives of our soldiers, than one could expect from any other army anywhere on this planet. And Israelis know that. And we're proud of our army. It means we're proud of our, in our case, of our boys, but it's of husbands and fathers, wives, mothers. It's an army that has women increasingly in frontline roles. And I think part of that trust comes from knowing that your leaders recognize when they fail and are willing to admit it.
One last question, because our time is almost up. How important is it to Israelis to see the support coming from Jews in the diaspora, to see rallies in the United States pro-Israel?
Israel has a decreasing number of supporters around the world for this war. And the initial rush of support for Israel as a victim has been replaced by a lot of attacks against Israel as we've, instead of embracing the role of victim, we've taken the role of a sovereign people who will defend itself, whatever that takes. And the most reliable source of support for Israel is the Jewish community around the world. And when we're largely alone and seeing ourselves condemned in throughout most of Europe and in very important circles within the United States, including the corridors of power, to know that we have a staunch ally out there in the form of the Jewish people and the American Jewish community, which is a community of great character and strength and courage. It's incredibly important. And when you see solidarity missions coming through Israel, it's a real boost. So I would say it's more important today than it's been at any point during this war when it looked like everybody was supporting us. It was great the American Jewish community was in the forefront. When that support has diminished, and as Israel's necessarily doing things that are unpopular, to see our true friends stepping up and willing to pay a price in order to be there with us, shoulder to shoulder in this battle around the world of enormous importance, and I would do anything possible to encourage that it be continued and strengthened.
On that note, to speak to the audience, whoever's listening to this, next Tuesday in Chicago in Daley Plaza at noon, the Jewish Federation is holding a rally in support of Israel for 1 hour. It'll take place. Security will be tight, but it's important we're there. Just for the reasons Dr. Polisar is saying, we have an opportunity to do something even from a distance to support Israel. Dr. Polisar, I want to thank you so very much for your insights and for your time as well. It's fascinating to learn from you, and I hope to continue to do so in the future. I also know you're going to be delivering a series of lectures of classes online for the Tikva Fund on the history of Theodor Herzl, the biography of the history of Theodor Herzl. I would encourage people to look into that as well. Thank you so very much. May your sons remain safe, and may this war come to a successful conclusion quickly. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you for this opportunity.
Bye-bye.